All right, so hopefully everyone can see that. Thumbs up. Yes. Awesome. All right, so bird identification is it's complex, right? There's a ton of detail, a ton of difficulties. John mentioned greater scop versus lesser scop. There's some really tricky identifications out there, and that's not what we're going to talk about today. So what we're going to talk about today is more of a guideline or framework that gets you hopefully a little bit closer to identifying what you're looking for. So it's actually, I don't know if you can see this, I'll hold it up again, but it's a book, it's a Peterson guide, Bird Identification in 12 Steps. It's a fairly thin book, and most of what I'm talking about tonight is basically taken from that. So a couple caveats. First of all, birding is supposed to be fun. There are certainly days in the field where I do not believe that, as I'm trying to identify a sparrow that's hiding underneath a branch in the shadows, and you just can't get a good look at it, and it's super frustrating. But the idea is that when we're out here, when we're trying to birding is supposed to be a fun thing to do. And as part of that, bird identification should be fun. So some of the steps that we're going to talk about, you don't have to do. Birding is whatever level of interest that you are interested in. For me personally, I really like identifying things. It's kind of the lister in me, and just the problem solving of seeing something and being able to figure out what it is. Other people are happy seeing behavior. They're interested in just seeing pretty things or beautiful things. And of course, all of that is okay. There's a definition that a good birder is someone who enjoys birding, and there really is nothing else beyond that. So one of the things I'm not going to be doing for the most part is really providing tips on identifying specific birds. So we're not going to go into the differences between Cassin's finches and house finches, which are the two birds in the picture here, or greater scop versus lesser scop, or how to identify different sparrows. Those are all really interesting topics, and perhaps that'll be something for a future meeting where we can focus on more of the advanced birding or intermediate to advanced birding. We're not going to be talking really about some of the tools for birding, so binoculars, field guides. I actually have my Sibley guide right here next to me. Hotspots, like we were talking about earlier, and things like that. But I will say that our next meeting, our February meeting on the 15th, is going to be more on those binoculars, field guides, sort of the tools and, I guess, locations, things like that. We're still working on that one. So if there's something that you're interested in, thinking more in terms of tools, let us know and we can try to cover some of that information. So if you're thinking about getting binoculars, but you're not sure what to look for, if you're thinking about getting a camera and you're not sure what to look for, you can ask us and we'll try to talk about that next month. But what we are going to try to do, what I am going to try to do, is provide guidelines that'll help you narrow down the possible identification of that bird. What we're really looking at here is trying to look at all the different possibilities, or narrow down from all the different possibilities until you get to the bird that you're actually looking at, ideally. That's sort of the ultimate situation. There's roughly 10,000 species of birds globally. There's over 1,000 species of birds in the US. So just the fact that we're in the US means that we've decreased our workload by 1/10. So we don't have to figure out how to identify ostriches versus emus. That's not something we need to worry about. And that's basically the idea as we go down to a narrower level. So Texas, being a big state, has about 650 species. New Mexico is almost at 550. So even though it's quite a bit smaller, there's a ton of diversity. And usually when I'm thinking about bird identification and birds that are possible in El Paso, I always turn to New Mexico, because there's so much in Texas that we just are unlikely to see in this area, whereas we're pretty much New Mexico. There's about 416 species reported in El Paso County, which is a lot. But even if you just narrow down even further, there's only about 150 species that have been seen in El Paso in the past couple of weeks. So what we're really trying to do is funnel from this big 10,000 species down to 1,000, down to 500, down to 400, down to 100. And once we get to that point, instead of having to flip through an entire field guide, now you're starting to go to a smaller section. And we're getting you to, the goal is to get you to that smaller area where you can then really focus on the details to figure out what the species is that you're actually looking at. This is the book that I was talking about, Peterson Guide to Bird Identification in 12 Steps. It's a pretty quick read. I would say pick it up, go to your favorite bookstore, your online book retailer, and take a look. It was a pretty interesting read. So the 12 steps that we're going to look at, and these are basically that funnel. So taxonomy, location, habitat, season, lighting, distance, behavior, sound, structure, plumage, variation, and notes. Now that already is a lot of information. But what we're looking at really, when we think about taxonomy, we're trying to figure out where in the field guide do we start. When we're thinking about location, habitat, and season, we're doing basically what I just went through. What's likely to be where and when you are looking. So you don't have to worry about the birds in El Paso that are only here during the summer if you're trying to identify a bird in your yard right now. You don't have to worry about what birds are present in Connecticut in the summer if you're trying to identify a bird in El Paso in the summer. So you don't have to worry about the birds that are in wetlands if you're standing on the top of Franklin Mountains. Lighting and distance, these are some factors that are considered external. So it's not the bird itself, but it's things that impact how you're able to see the bird. There's behavior and sound, which can be really important clues that have this benefit that you can often either see or hear them from a ways out. So even if you don't have a good look at a bird up close, sometimes behavior and sound can help. The structure, plumage, and variation, that's what we usually think about when we think bird identification. It's, you know, what color is the eyebrow? Does it have spots on the breast or not? That's the kind of stuff that we get to towards the end. And then taking notes. So trying to actually learn some of this stuff and also trying to remember some of it. All right, so taxonomy, this is not a science class, so you don't have to worry about it too much, but when we're talking about taxonomy, what we're really looking at is how we organize and name things, animals, plants, fungi. When we're talking about birds, we're focused in class Aves. For the most part, I mean, I'm assuming that if you're in an Audubon meeting, you know what a bird is, and knowing the difference between a bird and a mammal is not the level that you're interested in. You may not know what the species is because you're trying to identify it. And so it's these middle areas that are really useful. So thinking about the order, the family, and the genus that you're looking at. Some of the bird orders, this is a little bit fuzzy picture, but you can start thinking about these groups. And what's interesting about looking at these bird orders is it's how a lot of field guides are identified. So when you're trying to figure out what bird you're looking at and where to go looking for it, knowing a little bit about some of the bird orders can be a really useful thing. So knowing owls versus nightjars, knowing where the woodpeckers are, knowing what a woodpecker is, looking at some of the wading birds, things like that, that can be really, really useful. The reason that one of the reasons other than just helping you find stuff in your field guide is that birds in the same taxonomic group typically share some characteristics. So all owls share characteristics. If you're looking at a burrowing owl or a great horned owl or a long-eared owl or a screech owl, these all, you see one, you kind of know what you're looking at. So once you start thinking about these characteristics, you can go straight to that section of the field guide. An example that you can look at is thinking about wrens. So we have several species of wrens in El Paso. A good day, you can hit a 5 wren day, let's say. So you could get house, canyon, marsh, buicks, cactus, rocks. You could actually get like a 6 wren day without getting into anything particularly unusual. And wrens typically have barred wings and tails. They have long pointy bills. They usually have a melodic call of some sort. And so if you start seeing birds that look kind of like that, that gives you an idea that you need to be looking in the wrens. You may not know which wren you're looking at, but it gives you an idea that this is the area to focus in on. So this bird here, which I saw up near the Coronado Country Club in the last fall, it has the barred wings, it has the barred tail, it has a pointy bill. This is not a great picture. And so when I was looking at this, I was like, okay, so it's a wren. It's not a cactus wren. It's not a rock wren. Doesn't have enough of an eyebrow to be a Buick's and so on, and getting it down to a house wren. So being able to go through some of those characteristics. But again, not thinking about all of the different little birds that are out there that are in your field guide, but narrowing it down to a particular group to look at. This just gives you an idea from the Sibley book. So some of the different sections, the woodpeckers, flycatchers, jays and crows, tanagers, sparrows, and so on. So again, everything, if you know that you're looking at a sparrow, you know where to go to in your field guide. Most field guides will also have a section, this is looking at some of the shorebirds, where it, again, breaks things down to that lower taxonomic level of genus, where you can have pretty similar, so this would be, you know, first cousins in the bird world. So you can see the oyster catchers, for example, right there. Sorry, I'm pausing because I'm thinking there's a laser pointer option, but I don't know where it is, so I'm not going to worry about it. So anyway, the oyster catchers, they're stocky birds, big red bills. There's two different types, but they're pretty similar. So once you start getting down to that genus level, you can start to really limit your choices to a few things that you have to pick through. So the recommendations, try to learn some of the North American bird family. There's like 80 of them, so it's not a by the end of the day type thing, but start thinking about what are the different groups that are out there. And then as you're starting to learn about birds, try to pay attention to the names of the genus, in particular of the bird that you identify. And I'll admit, I'm horrible with this. I'm not much of a scientific name person, although I'm trying to get to that point. But if you start learning the names of the genus, then those different species that are in that genus should be pretty similar. So if you can identify one, you can get pretty close to the other. Okay, so that's taxonomy. So just getting you into that right area. So at least knowing that you're looking at an owl instead of looking at a penguin. The next piece is location. So what we're trying to do when we're thinking about location is figuring out which species are found where you are located. There's a lot of ways to do this. There's checklists. There's actually an Audubon, El Paso Audubon checklist that's floating around somewhere. You can do eBird sightings if you're more into the technological side of things. And you can also pay attention to the maps that are in your field guides, which is really important. So this is an example from the Sibley field guide. The colors vary based on which field guide you're looking at, but they're usually going to have some sort of summer range, winter range, year round, and migration. And so what is summer, you know, varies a little bit from bird to bird in terms of when they actually migrate. So some birds move earlier than others, and that's part of the fun of figuring things out. But right now, if you're trying to identify a bird that's in your yard and you look at a map and it's only in El Paso during the summer, then odds are that that's probably not the bird. There's exceptions to all these rules. So there's always the rarity, there's always the unusual thing that you're going to see. But for the most part, you know, probably 80 to 90% of the time, if not more, if it's not supposed to be here, it's probably the wrong bird. So here's an example. There's two grackles that look pretty similar to each other. The great-tailed grackle, which is the one that we have, and then there's boat-tailed grackles. And they both have big tails. There's some other details when you start looking at them. But if you see a grackle with a big tail and you're just flipping through your field guide and you're like, man, I don't know, is this a great-tailed grackle or a boat-tailed grackle? Well, you look at the maps, right? So if you're in El Paso and you see a grackle with a big long tail, you're going to have to be really, 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 really convinced that it's not a great tail. Great tail is the most likely one in our area. Boat tailed are basically in the Gulf Coast, and that's about it. So birds that superficially look the same, that range map and figuring out where you are and where the birds should be can really help to narrow down that field. So the recommendations, use those range maps. This is something I see on a lot of the online groups, not just the El Paso group, but others, where they see a bird and they say, aha, I think it's this thing. And one of the pieces that all of the bird identification groups ask for is location and date, because location tells you what's the likely stuff to be there, and date, again, helps with that, what's likely to be in that area. So just looking at maps, you can make some pretty good identifications. But the caveat, again, is that birds don't read field guides. Birds have wings. Birds are pretty good at sneaking around places that we aren't expecting. So this fall, there was this bird, which is a dark-eyed junco, sorry, yellow-eyed junco. You can see the bright yellow eye on that. That's a bird that is not supposed to be in El Paso. This was, I'd have to remember, but maybe like the 10th record of this species in all of Texas. It's something that was very unusual. So if you looked at the range map of it, you would say, you know, oh, it's a dark-eyed junco, because it looks like a dark-eyed junco except for that yellow eye. Dark-eyed junco is what's supposed to be here. Yellow-eyed junco is not. So you can't just ignore everything else. By looking at range maps helps to make a lot of those assumptions. I think there's actually a bird that John Casado saw by going through all of the 100 dark-eyed juncos that were in that field until he found the one unusual one. All right, so the last thing, thinking about location, or additional piece of thinking about location is habitat. So what type of habitat is the bird located in? What type of habitat is the bird? Are you looking in the wetlands? Are you in open water? Are you in shallow water? Or the bird, I should say. Desert scrub, dense forest. Are you in a grassland, etc.? So these are two birds that are actually both from Keystone Wetlands, which is near Doniphan and Sullivan Park, if you haven't been there. The gulls hang out in the wetland, the quail hang out in the uplands. So knowing where you are, again, helps to narrow down and identify what you're looking at. Just to kind of show that a little bit more, this is a Google Earth map of the wetland. The botanical garden is the lower center down here. Oh, can you see that? Can you see the laser pointer? Is that exciting? Am I just making things up? Anyway, so this is the wetland area down here. This is where you're going to find the ducks and the gulls and the shorebirds. But if you just go on the path and up into this upper area, you're basically into good desert habitat where you're going to find the quail, you're going to find thrashers, sparrows, a lot of more traditional desert birds. So even though you're in El Paso, you're looking at the habitat. It can also help you figure out what you're looking at. So the big recommendation on this is to read the description of the birds that you're considering to figure out information about habitat type. So you see something, you're kind of matching it up in your field guide. Look at the description. Don't just, picture book match what you're trying to see. So this painted bunting was at Rio Bosque, and if you read the habitat description in Sibley, it says found in grassy or weedy open areas near brush or trees. And if you look at it, it's there in the weeds, eating seeds in an area that was near trees. So it's a good way of, again, helping to figure out what you're looking at. The last piece on this sort of, is it even supposed to be there, is thinking about the season. Is it supposed to be there during that time? That gets to that idea of, breeding season versus, or summer versus winter, migration, things like that. These are two thrushes that look pretty similar. These both potentially occur in El Paso. You have a hermit thrush on, I don't even know what side that would be. It looks like my left. Maybe it's your left too. This bird up here. So if you're trying to figure it out, so you see a thrush today, you go out, you look for birds, you see a thrush, and you're thinking, man, I know that there's hermit thrush, I know that there's Swainson's thrush. There's something about the eye, the spectacles around the eye and the tail color, and man, these are really tough. Well, look at your map. So during winter, we're in the non-breeding wintering range for hermit thrush, whereas all the Swainson's thrush are down in Central America right now. So just by, looking at the range maps and knowing what time of year it is, you can pretty much eliminate Swainson's thrush as a possibility and go straight to hermit thrush. Again, not all birds read field guides, so you could have something else, but you're pretty sure that it's going to be a hermit. Some of the cool ways of figuring this out, there's bar charts that show when species are expected. So you can look at the maps in the field guides, but you can also go to, this is from eBird. A lot of checklists, I think our El Paso Audubon checklist has bar charts similar to this, but it gives you an idea of when species show up. The width of the bar tells you how common it is. So when it's just starting to show up, or if it's not a common species, that bar is really narrow, like you can see on the Costa's hummingbird, the middle one down here. It's a pretty unusual bird for us, so it does show up, but not common. Whereas black-chin hummingbirds, you can see this is our summer hummingbird, so it's a very common hummingbird for us. Now, looking at these two pictures, so these are two birds that we have. So this is a black-chinned female and an Anna's hummingbird female. If you see that bird that looks like that today, it's probably going to be an Anna's because our black-chinned have migrated south. They're summer birds for us. If you see a bird that looks like this in May, it's probably a black-chin because the Annas are basically fall and winter birds for us. Again, not 100%. You still want to do some of the other pieces there, but it helps to narrow down what you're thinking about for your considerations. So pay attention to those seasons. So the recommendation, pay attention to the seasons. Is the bird likely to be here right now or not? Is it something that, would just be a really unusual case? And really start to use eBird, bar charts, the maps and the field guides to figure out when the different species are expected in the area. This is a black-headed grosbeak. This is another, summer bird for us. So, starting in April-ish with migration, we are going to start seeing them show up again. By the end of October, they're pretty much gone. So when you start thinking about this, this is a bird that you don't even really have to consider at this time of year. And if you do see one this time of year, then it's really cool, and you should let us all know so we can go enjoy it. So one of the points that this book makes is that knowing where you are in terms of both location and habitat, when it is, and some basic taxonomy really puts you in a great spot to figure out what bird you're looking at. And a lot of bird identification really uses these different features to make assumptions about a bird identification. So a lot of times people can tell you what bird they're, experienced birders can tell you what the bird is without even seeing field marks, without seeing colors, without seeing much. They know the shape, they know that taxonomy, they know what's around this time of year in the area where you're at, and can give you a pretty good idea of what you're looking at. Okay, so gets us into the next section, lighting and distance. So these are some external factors that can impact identification. This is really more just like warning and tips as opposed to anything I'm going to tell you exactly what to do with. One issue with lighting is that, especially if you're a photographer, and we have some really good bird photographers in the group, different light really impacts what you see or what you think that you see. So seeing something at noon on a sunny day is going to look very different than noon on a cloudy day, and it's going to look very different from 7 in the morning and 7 at night. So there isn't a good trick to say only go birding at 7 or only go birding at 2, but it's more think about what you're seeing and what some of the differences that lighting can have on a bird. bright light can often wash out colors. It can really like blow out whites. So that if you have a bird like a gull that's really white and it's in full sun, there might be some features that are near that white part of the body that you basically can't see because it's so blown out by that bright lighting. The angle and the position of the bird and the viewer can also change the appearance of colors. One that I think a lot of us probably know about are our black-chinned hummingbird males. So they have a purple chin in the right light, but often it shows up as black, which is what gave them their name. A lot of the other male hummingbirds have the same feature, where that color that's in their gorget or their throat, a lot of it's based on basically structure in the feathers itself that cause weird light refraction. So it's not even a pigment, it's actually just the way that the light refracts off of the feathers. And so if it's something that's really based on the light reflection, how that bird is positioned can make a really big difference. I think that's about, so just in terms of a tip, move around, try to figure out if there's a different angle, be aware of where the sun is, make sure that if it's a bird in the shadow, its light's gonna look different than that bird that's out in the full light. Some people really like, cloudy days, but sometimes cloudy days make everything look kind of gray. So just be aware that that variation exists. Distance is one that I'm very guilty of. I'm always more happy to identify a bird that's a mile away than the one that's 10 feet away. There's just something, it's like the one out there has got to be the cool one. But some birds are just too far away to identify. And you have to just accept that not every bird that you see is going to be identifiable. This is a page from a book. I'll show you the cover of it in a second, called the Crossley Guide, where he takes a bunch of pictures of the same species and puts them sort of in a photorealistic position to where you can see, what does that bird look like up close? What does that bird look like way off in the distance? Which can be really useful as you're trying to learn what birds look like in different areas. Distance can really make judging size difficult. We actually had this at Waco Tanks on our bird tour on Saturday. There was a ladderback woodpecker in a tree kind of far away, and one of the people that was with us was like, that looks like a ladderback, but it looks huge. It looks so much larger than the ladderbacks that I have in my yard. And it was probably just a trick of perspective, where it was far enough away, the branch that it was on was just a weird size relative to what he was used to, and it just made it really tricky. So this is something that I just read about in the book that I thought would actually be pretty cool. So if you're trying to improve identification at a distance, one of the things you can do as practice is, especially with things like raptors that are flying around, if you know what bird it is up close, watch it as it moves away, as it flies away from you, and try to pay attention to the shape, pay attention to how the color changes, because you know what the bird is, because you saw it, you identified what it was, and as it starts to get farther and farther away, you can start to look for some of those tricks. If you can see, even on this small picture up at the top, depending on your screen size, one of the things with Swainson's hawks is they tend, at least the light morph ones, have this trailing dark edge. And so that's a bird that, with practice, you can identify, driving down Mesa or driving on I-10 and just seeing it soaring, because it has that fairly distinctive feature. This is the guide that I was talking about, Crossley's guide. He has a guide to eastern birds where he's done sort of the same thing and has just a bunch of pictures and a bunch of variety in there. They're pretty big books. They're not necessarily something you'd want to, toss in your backpack and take out in the field with you, but pretty interesting reading. So pay attention to how lighting and distance influence what you're seeing. Try to move around to see if you can change the shape of the bird. And then also you can focus on the shape and size of the birds when colors are hard to distinguish. So this was a Savannah sparrow that was very, backlit and washed out, but, moved around to a different location, was able to see it in better lighting. All right, behavior. So what's a bird doing? And there's a ton of behaviors, right? Like we could have an entire class on bird behavior. But some of the stuff you want to think about is, are they flicking their tail? Are they bobbing? Are they moving really fast, or are they moving kind of slow? How are they foraging? Like curve-billed thrashers that a lot of us see in our yards, they use their bill and they thrash back and forth to look for bugs. Sparrows, like white-crowned sparrows, some of the juncos, they kick with their feet. And so seeing those differences in how they forage can help take you into an identification. One of the things to note is behaviors can change with the sex of the bird, the location, the time of year. This painted bunting in full, song, this is a male out on an exposed branch singing. Females are not likely to do this. This is a bird, that's demonstrating its fitness to potential mates. So thinking of behavior, let's see if this works. This is let me start over. Spotted sandpiper, and they just bob their butts. They're tail bobbers. They can't help it. This one's in breeding plumage, and you can see all the spots. The ones we see at this time of year are not in breeding plumage, but if you see a sandpiper walking down a drainage canal and it's just bopping like that, that's probably a spotted sandpiper. The other bird that we see a lot, especially this time of year, are ruby-crowned kinglets. These are just fast little active birds. And so you can see even this person that was videoing it, it's hard to keep it in the frame because it's so active. This type of behavioral clue can really help point out what you're looking at. Other birds that might be a similar size are going to move at a much slower pace. Bird behavior can also alert you to other birds. So some of the behavior you can see is mobbing. So these are some blackbirds that are mobbing a redtail. And a lot of times, anytime I see a bird, like a smaller bird kind of dive bombing a tree, I'm like, there's got to be an owl in there. I'm going to go look for the owl. I have yet to find an owl, but one of these days I will find an owl when a bird is mobbing. You'll see kestrels mobbing bigger birds, little birds mobbing hawks, and it's a defense behavior where they're basically telling the bird, I know where you are, and get out of my neighborhood. So that can help alert you to birds. The other thing that happens sometimes is flushing. So if anybody has backyard feeders and you have a bunch of birds out, and then all of a sudden they all fly, right? So they're down on the ground, they're pecking at the seed, and then something happens and they all flush into a tree. Sometimes it's a pigeon flies in, or you open a door or something like that. But sometimes what they're looking, they're alert for other raptors or for raptors coming around. So a lot of times that flush of movement, you can look at the bird, but you also want to look up and see if you can find that raptor that might have scared the bird off. So pay attention to behavior. Again, there's a ton of behaviors. It's hard to say just what there is, but a lot of times if it's a behavior that is particularly unique or helps identify that bird, it will be described in the field guide. So, like that bobbing behavior of the spotted sandpiper. The other nice thing about behaviors is that they're often things you can see from a distance. So before you can see other field marks or plumage or things like that, you can see the type of behavior that it's doing. All right, bird song. Sorry. So I will also tell you, I am not good at birding by ear. Birding by ear is a whole other skill set. There's some people who are really good at it, and they can identify a bird by its call from 50 feet or more. But it's a skill that's definitely worth working on because it does help a lot with identification. So one of the reasons for that is that calls and songs can be heard in the dark. They can be heard through vegetation. You can hear them behind you, above you, below you. You can often hear birds calling from further away than you would notice if you're just looking for them. And so really paying attention to sound can be helpful, even if it's just something that attracts you to a bird where you're like, oh, I heard something over there, let me go look for it. Like even that is a great skill. So learning sounds can be difficult, but it does help. Especially difficult when you have things like mockingbirds, which have a repertoire that includes a lot of other calls. So mockingbirds can certainly be a confusing one if all you're doing is hearing them. Just a little distinction, songs versus calls. Songs are usually for attracting mates or defending territories. They typically are longer, they typically are more complex. They're usually done by males, and it's usually a seasonal thing where they're it's during a breeding season or a territorial defense. Calls tend to be shorter, like chip notes, and they could be warnings about predators. So, hey, there's an owl over there. It could be keeping the birds together in a flock. And again, they tend to be a shorter chip sound. So white-crowned sparrows like this one, you hear their calls a lot, but we don't often hear their songs because they breed further north than where we are. So, like I said, learning songs could be a whole other class as well. But start with some of the common species. So things that you see a lot. Find an individual you can actually watch, because what you're trying to do is link that visual cue to the auditory cue. So something like a Gambel's quail, like this picture, they aren't often sitting up in the open like this, especially if you go someplace like Rio Bosque where there's a lot of understory vegetation. The number of times I've actually seen a quail out there is small compared to the number of times I've heard quail or flushed them and they go just shooting across the trail. But being able to see that bird, listen to it, really helps to make that cue. If you have time, write a description of what that call or song is. A lot of bird field guides will have the song described. It's definitely an interpretation to guess what that actually means. But take a look at that. And then if you're a visual learner, there's some cool things people are doing now with sonograms, which is basically this structure where you're mapping out the frequency of the call. So the kilohertz of the call, the length of the call. This is a black-capped chickadee, which I don't think I set it up where sound is going to play. Yeah, I forgot to click the right button when I was sharing. But you can see a black-capped chickadee call has a higher call, a pause, and then a call, a small break, and another piece of the call. So things that you hear and it just kind of like blurs past you, looking at them in sonograms can sometimes be really helpful. And with technology improving, people are starting to get a lot more. Basically, you can map sonograms. There's apps for phones where you can get a sonogram of something you record. So definitely a good idea for learning calls and songs. All right, I might actually get done in the amount of time I'm trying. So the crazy thing now, right? So if you think about typically in bird identification, it's like, what does it look like? And for the most part, we haven't really talked about what it looks like. We've talked about sort of general taxonomy shape. We've talked about where it is, when it is, what's it doing, what's it sound like. Now we're going to talk about what does it really look like? What's that final piece? The structure, the plumage, and then, because life is always difficult, variation within that. So when we're thinking about structure, we're usually thinking about a combination of size and shape. One of the notes about size is really difficult. A lot of times the size that you see in a field guide is based on museum specimens. And a lot of times you just see a single number. It's 12 inches tall. It's like, well, okay, but most things in nature have more variation, and it helps to see or being aware that some of that variation exists. So as an example with song sparrows, and there's a ton of variation within the same species based on where you're located. So really big ones up in Alaska, all the way down to the smaller ones that we have here. One of the reasons field guides don't say all of this is because they're already pretty dense with information. So if they start giving size ranges and heights and everything else, it's going to become pretty tricky. So just be aware that size is kind of that if you only see a single number, it's probably an average of a lot of variation that's out there. When we're thinking about size, a lot of times proportionality is more important than any particular measurement. And so what do we mean by proportionality? These are two shorebirds called yellowlegs, greater yellowlegs and lesser yellowlegs. Greater is bigger than lesser. So you can just feel like, oh, I'll just look for this situation in the field and know that the bigger one is the greater and the smaller one is the lesser, and I'm done. Well, these birds don't always exist in the same habitat. You don't always have a greater and a lesser sitting right next to each other like this, awesome picture. And so you have to start thinking about comparing sizes on a bird to itself. So think about bill size. Greater yellowlegs tend to have really long bills. The estimate is usually that it's 1.5 times greater than the length of the head. So if you were to imagine, measure the length of the head from the base of the bill to the back of the head, and then kind of superimpose it onto the bill, and then it's another half. So it's like a 1.5. So it's a long bill relative to the proportion of the head. A lesser, you look at that size of the head and it's maybe 1 and a little bit of change. So it's a smaller bill, a shorter bill relative to the size of the bird. It's proportionally shorter. There's other features along with that, but just thinking in terms of, what's the proportion? We can't just say, that look for a bill that's 6 inches long, because most birds are not going to wait for you to run out there with a tape measure and figure out how tall it is and how long the bill is. You're going to have to, do a little bit more guesswork. And it's often better with comparisons. And I mean, ideally, you have the two birds you're trying to compare right next to each other. But you can also think about sizes of birds that you're more familiar with. So are you familiar with grackles? And is the bird that you're looking at bigger or smaller than a grackle, or the same size? Are you familiar with house finches? Is it bigger or smaller than a house finch? Are you familiar with red-tailed hawks? Are they bigger or smaller than that? There are some challenges. Size can vary with age and sex. Some birds, the males are bigger. Some birds, the females are bigger. Again, it's usually a tricky thing to tell, but it does impact size. They can also change with age. So a lot of times when birds fledge from their nest, where we're going to see them, they're roughly adult size, but it could be that their wings haven't fully filled in, or the body hasn't filled in all the way. So even though they're of essentially adult size, they still maybe are growing out instead of growing up, right? Birds are three-dimensional, so you have to think about all the dimensions. The other thing is that shapes change with different behaviors. So if a bird is soaring versus diving, it's going to change the behavior. If it's perched versus foraging, it can change the behavior. If it's alert versus calm, it can change the behavior. These are Lincoln sparrows. I always think of Lincoln sparrows as having this sort of jaunty little crest, but they don't have to. Anything that's just kind of feathers going up is something that they can also have the feathers going down. Or a bird can be fluffed, or a bird, especially in winter, a lot of the birds are very fluffy. So think about size, but size can be tricky. So again, recommendations, think about a bird size that you're familiar with. Like, I'm sure we've all seen white-winged doves. Is the bird you're looking at bigger or smaller than a white-winged dove? Focus on those proportions. And then again, just be aware of variability. There isn't a ton we can do with it because most field guides won't go into that full detail, but just be aware that it exists. You could just be looking at a small individual of that species or a big individual of that species. All right, plumage. So looking at the feathers. So you would look at these and you would probably identify both of these as owls. Again, thinking about the family, they've got sort of the disc-shaped faces, the eyes pointing forward. There's a burrowing owl from Mascaridae and a great horned owl out at Rio Bosque. So when we're thinking about plumage, we're trying to think about field marks usually. So what are the distinctive traits? Do they have stripes in a particular area, or spots, or patterns, or colors? Sometimes when we talk about field marks, we also include legs and bills. So not just plumage, but just thinking in terms of plumage in this case. So this is a screenshot from an app that I have, iBird. looking at burrowing owls, and here's some nice pictures of it, and you can see it, and you can try to match it. But one of the cool things that a lot of the field guides have is the ability to look at what those field marks are. So thinking about, oh, the white chin and the throat, yeah, I do see that on burrowing owls. That is something that helps to distinguish them. That eyebrow, yeah, that's definitely something that they have. They don't have tufts. If you think about the burrowing owl versus the great horned owl had those tufts and the burrowing owl didn't. You can start thinking about the juvies versus the adults. The adults have the barring, the juveniles don't. The faces are a little bit different. So looking at those field marks can be really helpful as you're trying to, again, learn what bird you're looking at. I am not going to quiz you on this. This is just to let you know that this is something to look at. So a lot of times, every field guide is going to have bird topography charts in the beginning of it. This is a perching bird. They usually will have perching birds, waterfowl, shorebirds. I think that might be it. Gulls, I think gulls are usually in there. And just labeling the different parts. And the reason this is helpful is that a lot of times in field guides, they will say, you know, dark malar stripe, buffy auriculars. And if you don't know either what those terms are or where to look in your field guide, it's all, well, usually Latin to us. So it's worth spending some time to try to figure out what you're looking at. Or again, especially knowing where it is in your field guide. But this is not an ornithology class, so we don't need to go past that. One other sort of caveat to think about is the molt. Molt is replacement of the feathers. It can be done once or twice a year. Some birds do it on the breeding ground, some do it in wintering grounds, some do some of it in each. Sometimes males molt between breeding and non-breeding plumage. So northern shovelers, a lot of times we see them starting in the non-breeding plumage because we are their wintering ground. But usually by this time of year, maybe a little bit later before they migrate north, they have these really nice bright green heads and the white breasts and the buffy sides. So molt, again, whole other class, whole other thing, but interesting to think about. So pay attention to the plumage, but don't forget everything else. Think about learning some of the topography and don't forget about the molt. All right, remember there's 12 steps, we're on 11, we are almost there. So this is basically like, okay, everything we just talked about is for average birds, but there's variation. In some cases, it's super obvious. A male cardinal versus a female cardinal, a male painted bunting versus a female painted bunting. Some cases it can be a lot more subtle. So these are a bunch of, I think they're all ring-billed gulls from Ascaridae. Ascaridae will have hundreds of ring-billed gulls during the winter. Sorry, not Ascaridae, Keystone. And you can go through and find different ages. You can find potentially different gulls. But there's variation in what you're looking at. So how old the bird is, what sex the bird is, what season you're looking at, combinations of all of that can impact what the bird is going to look like. Can sometimes be regional differences, like that picture of the song sparrows, where a bird in the East Coast looks different than a bird in the West Coast. And then there's just individual differences. Not every bird looks the same. It's something that's kind of fun to do if you spend time looking at birds in your backyard. Can you start to pick out any of the individuals? Is there a bird that has like a white feather over its forehead that the other birds don't have? So thinking about that variation. Finally, if you're trying to really learn this information and you want to become, an expert birder, it can be really helpful to have some sort of note-taking. It's helpful with learning. It's also, writing down things often helps. It can help you remember what you saw and when. It can help you relive trips. You can go analog, so having a notebook. These are two examples from this article. This is basically just a checklist. It's got the date, it's got the location, it's got the birds. Here's another way where they're actually doing field sketches. So really trying to figure out, what does that bird look like? You can obviously take pictures as well, but sometimes drawing gives you a little bit better feel for it. But you can also go digital. You can look at eBird as a digital tool. You can blog. You can just have a Word document if you want. eBird is great. I've given a presentation on eBird in the past. We can do another one at some point if people are interested. But you can actually now add photos and sound to your eBird list. You can add comments. There's this birder named Ted Floyd, no relation, who does some pretty crazy notes. You can actually see his eBird lists on eBird and see where everything is. So how detailed you go. Even something as simple, I mostly take pictures and eBird lists. So you can go with whatever level of detail you want. All right, so these are the 12 steps. Since I'm running short on time, I won't go through them again. But again, the idea with all of this is instead of looking at a bird and thinking about the color first, think about the taxonomy, think about where you are, think about what it's doing, and sort of narrow things down from there. Some of the other tips, spend time observing the bird before you go to your field guide. So a lot of times you see a bird and the first thing you want to do is start flipping through. Really look for that. Think about those features, think about the behavior, really try to get a good feel for it before you start looking it up. Use multiple clues. We have variations, so you need to be thinking about behavior plus color plus time of year, so all these things together. And then it really helps to learn with other birders, either online or in person. So if you're a Facebook user, there's some really great Facebook identification groups that you can learn a lot from. Star mentioned at the beginning, we are doing field trips again. Oh, whoever is unmuted, do you mind muting yourself? Thank you. And going in person is a great way to learn. So, once we're able to do more stuff in person, going on the trips, being able to point, look at a bird and have somebody who maybe knows them a little bit better help to identify it for you and walk through the different steps. So the plug, February 15th, we're going to talk more about tools for birdings. And I've just talked about a 130-page book in 45 minutes. So let me know if you have any questions that have popped up. But other than that, I am done.
Kevin, you did have a question on the chat early on, and it was, when is the best time to bird?
When you're awake. There's always good times to bird. So we always have things changing. It depends on what you're looking for. So this time of year is really good for waterfowl. We're a wintering range for a lot of ducks. So going to Ascaridae, going to Keystone, going to Rio Bosque, those are the three best duck spots in town. During April and May is spring migration, so we get warblers coming through and tanagers and things like that. During the summer, it can slow down a little bit. So I'd say the hottest part of the summer, so kind of July, August, can be pretty slow. Part of it is that a lot of the birds that are breeding here have already bred, and so they're not calling, they're on the nest, they're foraging. So it's just not as obvious. They might be around, but you're not going to see them as easily. But then by August, we're already seeing hummingbirds come back through and shorebirds come back through. And then we get fall migration. This last fall was amazing. And now we're in winter and there's goldfinches I need to go see and a lesser black-backed gull. And yeah, so any time of year is good. In the summer, mornings are better than afternoons. Other questions?
Yes, Kevin. This
Yes.
is Carrie Ann.
Hey, Carrie.
I love the Zoom. Is there any chance that once this COVID mess is over, we could also have the meetings both in person and on Zoom?
Everything's possible, right? So we'll have to figure out what the technology would be to see if there's a way to live stream the meetings. It's certainly possible. So I think we'll probably, I mean, the hope is to go back to face when that's possible, but if there's a way we can do both. I know a lot of schools are doing both right now, where they have some students in the classroom and some online, so we might be able to learn from that technology and make that work. But I'll definitely keep it in mind, because it does, I mean, we've got almost 40 people on the call, and I don't think we've had 40 people at a meeting in years.
Yeah, I just flat out don't drive at night, so there would have been no way I would have come. But at home, I can do this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I know, it's a lot. Brains are leaking out of ears. I can see it.
Question, Kevin, if somebody was asking if the meeting will be able, they'll be able to view the meeting again, and I think you talked about it at the beginning, but can you just repeat?
Yeah, so we are recording, so as long as the internet doesn't break, we'll have it downloaded, and then we did set up a YouTube channel. We just haven't put anything on it yet, but hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll get our presentations up on YouTube for people to view.
And I'm not seeing any questions, but I am getting a lot of great job, very informative, great presentation. So
You too can read a book and tell people about it.
Yay, Kevin. Good job.
All right, well.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it. Very good.
And I will, like I said, I probably do a quarter of all the stuff I just said you're supposed to do. So, you know, it's a framework, right? So, oh, I see here, let's see, there's a question about questions. Oh, yes, I do have some of the lists of questions from before. Let me look at those. So there is a question about the best time of year to see birds, and we answered that. Should we have feeders or suet out now? Both. So suet is basically a high-fat food that when the weather's cold, we've had a surprisingly cold winter, I would say. We've had a lot of mornings that are below freezing. So birds really like suet. Birds have really high metabolisms and burn through a lot of energy, especially when they have to stay warm overnight. And suet is a great way to provide birds high-fat food. So that's great. We can run into problems in the summer where it's so hot it melts. So, and that's just kind of gross. But otherwise, that's great. Having feeders out is also great. Depending on where you live, I know like John and some other people still have hummingbirds. Typically higher up in the mountains, you have hummingbirds year round. So you can certainly keep feeding them. If you're a place where you haven't seen hummingbirds for a while, you can take those down. The notes with feeding is just make sure that you clean the feeders with some regularity, and you should rotate them around because the birds will poop all over wherever the spot is. Or you can have yards like John and Kathy's, that's just all one giant bird feeder and just birds everywhere. Let's see. And then there was a question, when birds look similar to one another, what's the best practice to help determine positive identification? That's like the next level, right? So what we talked about today is kind of getting you to, it's a sapsucker. So here's a story from this morning. I was actually at UTEP today and saw a bird. I was like, oh, it's a woodpecker. Maybe it's a ladderback woodpecker, female, but it doesn't quite look right. So of course I have my binoculars in my office. I go and get it, and it's a sapsucker. And so here we've got red-naped and yellow-bellied are the two more common. Going through all the checklists, the most common is red-naped. So trying to figure out if it's a yellow-bellied, you have to rule out it being a red-naped. So then it was getting pictures, looking at field marks. I think it's yellow-bellied. I'll have to send a picture to John, some of the better birders. But that's basically the step, is to try to get it down to the couple that you think it's going to be, and then do as much observation as you can. Try to see as many of the field marks as you can, get pictures if possible, or notes on what it is, and then either go to the field guide or ask for help. And some of them, like red-naped versus yellow-bellied sapsuckers, you've got to, you know, there's articles, 10-page articles written about them, and some of them hybridize, which is a whole other issue. So get it to the fewest number of choices possible, and then pull your hair out over those. That's the advice for that final ID. I think those are the questions from on the, at least the registration that I got right before the meeting. So if there's anything else, either unmute or drop it in the chat. Or of course, feel free to go have a drink, eat dinner, think about birds, plan your next birding excursion. So I'll stay on if anyone has any other last questions, but otherwise, thank you all for coming. Keep your eyes open for the registration for the February meeting. Our March meeting is going to be someone with the Peregrine Fund, I believe, talking about the Alplumado falcons in Texas, if I remember correctly. Excuse me, and like Heather said, we don't have April or May figured out yet. So if you have ideas, drop them our way.
Thank you.
Heather, good job.
Said February is already available. Yes, I'm